This is Model Steam Engine's Top Tip Time Part 2. In many of my videos I feature something called Top Tip Time, where I will try and emphasize a particularly good bit of useful information, but it occurs to me that there are a lot more top tips in my videos than the ones I normally feature. Here are some examples when I was fitting some parts together on a 7¼ inch gauge Sweet William steam locomotive. I'm going to need a couple of larger Barco spanners for the next job, which is fitting the first of the 2 steam unions into the smoke box. If you've been following this series, you'll be familiar with what I did with the steam unions. I milled a flat on each side, so now instead of having to use a pair of grips, I can use a spanner. I'm using the smaller, slightly more delicate Barco spanner on the outside and the larger one on the inside to turn the nut. The reason for this is the more delicate Barco spanner, the slightly smaller one, is less likely to mark the paintwork on the smoke box. And as I'm doing the job, I am keeping the spanner slightly away from the smoke box to prevent this from happening. And I'm also making sure that the position of this union has the flat part at the top and bottom and perfectly level with the smoke box saddle. This is what the brass union looks like when it's bolted in place. On this side, when I fitted the steam pipe flange onto the mounting studs, the pipe fitted into the union perfectly. This wasn't the case on the other side. This was one of the few fittings that would tighten by hand. Of course, I finished off the tightening using a spanner, but I did not over-tighten it. It's not necessary. It's top tip time. I'm about to refit the oil check valve into the steam chest at this side. But when I use my Barco spanner to grip the body of the check valve, I can't rotate it. A little bit more force other than hand pressure is required. So I use one Barco spanner and another Barco spanner like this. No, I am not sponsored by Barco. I am merely showing how using 2 spanners together can be quite useful, especially if they're adjustable and made by Barco. The union nut on this side was not over tightened and it went on very easily, and here I'm just nipping it up. The pipe is now held securely to the fitting. The fitting I'm going to be working on was attached underneath the smoke box in this hole. I'll show you what I mean. All it is a guide for the blast pipe. When this was fitted by the builder, it was tightened so much that the end of it is distorted and follows the curve of the smoke box. What I'm going to do first of all is make a new nut. This is actually a large union nut and I turned away quite a lot of the front of it. I've moved it into a position so I can turn away a bit more. Notice how I pushed the nut into the main chuck using the tailstock chuck. The main chuck was only tightened slightly initially, and after it was aligned in the chuck, I tightened it further. This is now no longer a union nut, and all I need to do is make it look better by using a chamfer tool. As you can see in this clip, the chamfer tool is very close to the chuck itself, and I'm using the rear part of the chamfer tool. And because this part of it hasn't been used much, it's very sharp and it cuts very cleanly. The thread on this fitting is not tapered, it's just a parallel thread that is damaged. The new modified union nut screws onto the fitting perfectly, but after this position it starts to get tight and feels uncomfortable, so I'm removing it. The first thing to do is to use some emery cloth to clean up the outside of the damaged threads. I know the part isn't running true in the chuck. It's very difficult to make it run true because the end flange is distorted. Now the nut screws on a little bit further, but it still feels very rough. And now it's top tip time, but first a serious health and safety warning. What you are about to see is a dangerous practice. I cannot recommend doing this, and I am just using the video clip to show the way that I reprofiled the damaged thread using a small needle file. It is absolutely essential to run the lathe very slowly and in reverse, so that the needle file always moves away from the chuck. Pretty much like you see here. This is a 3-cornered file, and I just hold it against the work. In this clip you can clearly see the distortion of the end flange. This clip was taken to demonstrate the principle. Shortly after this, when I did the job for real, I moved the needle file back and forth as it was traversing the work. because generally speaking files do not cut very well in reverse, so I just helped it along a little bit. I made several passes and then eventually the job was finished, and I took the part over to the workbench, and here I'm cleaning it up using a very stiff brush. And now the nut screws all the way down the thread, and it doesn't feel slack, it just feels good. The nut, that is. As you can see, I fitted an O-ring because I want this to seal against the smoke box. And as well as the O-ring that's going to seal against the smoke box on the inside, I'm using another smaller O-ring inside the union nut, which will make this blast pipe and fitting fully airtight when it's in the smoke box. Because I'm using O-rings, I won't have to over-tighten these nuts. I'll just use sufficient pressure to seal both of the O-rings in their respective places. That's it for this episode of Top Tip Time. Stay safe, stay healthy. Thanks for watching, and I hope you found it useful. Please take the time to visit my Mainsteam Models website and click on the section of the website that says Video Playlists. And by doing that, you can find other videos that you may like to watch. And by using the playlists, you can actually watch the videos back to back.